Today is session 18 on the rise of nationalism and imperialism. Before we get started, I just would like to say a quick Hail Mary. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Thank you. So this study I actually find fascinating myself. I'm actually picking up a lot of historical things that I missed when I was younger. Forces me to study. So I'm going to be talking about the rise of nationalism and imperialism. Basically, in the 19th century, there was a lot of change. The religious was challenged by liberal schools of thought. I'll talk a little bit about that. There was a lot of revolution. Political systems were changing. There was technological. I don't think of the 1800s as technological compared to today, but when you look back at it, there's really some a transformational change to the culture because of technological through the Industrial Revolution. Economic changes, new schools of thought. Now that there was all this new technology that changed the world system and brought a lot of social upheaval and change in cultural norms. First, I'll talk about Blessed Pio IX, or Pius IX, who was reigned from 1846 to 1878. So he was a pontiff. There's two pontiffs during the period that I'm going to be discussing today, and he was one of them, and also very instrumental for some of the church's teachings in that regard, and some of the changes, managing the changes from a church perspective. At the time, many liberals put hope in Pius IX. They were young. He was young, and they thought he would embrace new ideologies. He's a pope who took his pastoral mission seriously. He had a greater tolerance for the Jews in Rome. He visited the poor and the sick. He introduced tax reform. Now, this probably sounds kind of weird, but the Pope introducing tax reform? Well, at that time, there was still what's known as the Papal States, which was a temporal government. So that there was the church, which also had a temporal government at the time. He established agricultural institutes to help farmers. And he defined the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, and invoked, of which the Immaculate Conception is invoked as the patroness of the Americas. And he was the last pope to have a temporal rule, and you'll hear more about that. So, liberal thinking at the time equated Catholic Church with the old monarchies, which were deemed outdated and crumbling. Many liberal thinkers and revolutionaries at the time outright attacked the church. So basically, liberalism embraced new ideas, and one of them humanism, but it was from very much a secular perspective. So it actually sort of shoved the church away. Of course, when you put the church out of it, it opens up for a lot of different things. So, to continue with some of the many of the things from last week in terms of the changes, there was just a lot of revolution, a lot of things going on. And last week, Metternich was mentioned as a conservative who tried to keep the old school together, and he was on Austria, a leader in Austria. There was more revolution in France. There was what was called the Barricades in 1848. There was a cultural divide between the bourgeoisie and the rural French. And there was another Napoleon, Napoleon III, Bonaparte III, who was the nephew of the first Napoleon. He took over in a coup d'etat. It resulted in liberal students in ending Metternich's reign. Protests spread to Hungary and Bohemia. By the way, just a little bit of trivia. BMW, the automotive company, that actually stands for Bohemian Motor Works. Italian nationalist Giuseppe Mazzini, who was a liberal Freemason, and Garibaldi gained momentum and overran the Papal States. The French under Napoleon retook Rome and the Papal States in 1850, where Blessed Pio returned, but no longer with temporal power. So, seems like, okay. So, Blessed Pio opposed and protested the revolutionary excesses, which made him an enemy to many. The Italian nationalists Giuseppe Mazzini and Garibaldi led a campaign and took over Italy and proclaimed a new Roman Republic at which the Pope was forced to flee. And it was actually the French under Napoleon III retook Rome and the Papal States in 1850, which set up the return for Blessed Pio. However, when he returned, he was no longer a temporal ruler. So this was the start of an era where the Pope became more of a purely moral and spiritual leader, and there were some doctrines or dogma that came about at the time that sort of, interestingly enough, ironically falls in line with those changes. So liberal revolutions divided the Catholics. Some believed anti-clericalism was implicit in liberalism. Others hoped liberalism and Catholicism could find common ground. There were two German universities that became centers of ideological thoughts and discussions. One in Mainz believed liberal ideas were too secular and looked at the Pope as the last defender of the Catholic cause. These Catholics became what is known as ultramontanists, which translates sort of over the mountains, who looked at the Pope for centrality in leadership. The other school in Munich recognized an inevitable trend of European governments towards liberal democracy and sought to build bridges of mutual understanding between the church and the democratic regimes. So these thinkers were optimistic about modern culture and believed the church leaders could coexist with liberal ideas. The German theologian Johann Müllner proposed a number of reforms, like the use of vernacular in the liturgy. Some of his ideas would eventually be adopted in Vatican II in the 1960s. Also, John Henry Newman, an Anglican converted to Catholicism, worried about ultramontanists starting a church within a church. That probably sounds familiar if you kind of think of what's known as the St. Pius X Society after Vatican II, when there was kind of a split from old school to new school. It kind of reminds me of that. He believed the church should not shrink into itself and narrow the lines of communication and tremble at freedom of thought in language of dismay and despair. . So, looking at this, I would say, is there still a secular battle of liberalism and the church going on today in the U.S.? I see a lot of parallels there. So I want to talk a little bit about Blessed John Henry Newman. He was born in England, an Anglican, became an Anglican priest. He was very famous and influential preacher in England, and researched history of the church to bring Anglican church closer to the true Church of Christ. He discovered along the way that the Catholic Church fit the bill for what he was actually trying to achieve. Interesting. So the Catholic minority, or the Papists as they were called, were scorned and hated in England by the Protestant majority. Blessed Newman grew up believing the Catholic Church taught superstitious doctrine contrary to the Gospels. He joined what was called the Oxford Movement, which was a group of Anglicans who attempted to reestablish the lost doctrines of the Anglican Church, and with his gifts became a leading spokesperson for the cause. It's kind of interesting. He eventually came to the realization that everything he was defending could be found entirely in the Catholic Church. Imagine that. This led to his conversion to Catholicism, and after he was ordained a priest and eventually became a cardinal. So he became a very strong proponent of leading many to the Catholic Church as a result of his conversion. So also, during this time, Blessed Pope Pius IX declared the dogma of in 1854 of the Immaculate Conception, which basically states that Mary was conceived without sin. And this brought questions of liberalism and papal authority to the forefront of debate in the church. You might ask, well, how does that do that? Throughout church history, Mary had always always been venerated as the Immaculate Conception, and the theology of this title goes back to the early centuries. So this is actually really nothing new. It's just essentially codifying what was already known. As Jesus is known as the new Adam, Mary is also known as the new Eve. As Eve was created without original sin, so was Mary created without original sin. So in a profound way, Jesus and Mary are the true fulfillment of what Adam and Eve were intended to be. So I just find that absolutely fascinating. Just, to me, it just kind of solidifies my faith. So also, shortly after that, there was the famous apparition of Our Lady of Lourdes. So Our Lady of Lourdes, she appeared in 1858 to a Saint Bernadette Subaru, named after the car, right? But by the way, my son-in-law loves Subarus, so I told him this. He was like, he wants to be a deacon, and so he's very active in this church, so he absolutely loved Saint Bernadette now. So the Blessed Mother appeared to Saint Bernadette, and Mary announced herself at one of the apparitions as the Immaculate Conception. So this occurred at a very pivotal time in history. You know, Europe was being swallowed up, and the faith was being abandoned for secular liberal ideas. The Curé of Lourdes asked Bernadette to ask the lady that she was seeing, and Our Lady announced herself as the Immaculate Conception. Bernadette, at her age, she was 14 at the time, was unaware of the dogma of the Immaculate Conception that was declared 4 years prior. So they didn't have the internet at that time, so she didn't really do a Google search and find out. Our Lady requested Bernadette dig a spring which brought forth God's healing powers through acts of faith. In all, Bernadette received 18 visitations over a 6-month period. Her apparitions were declared authentic in 1862, and today, Lourdes is one of the world's most popular pilgrimage sites where miraculous healings from its holy water have occurred to thousands of people from all over the world. Bernadette was declared a saint in 1933 by St. Pius X, and her body, which is located in Nevers, France, is incorruptible. So I actually was fortunate on a business trip to France in Toulouse to have a weekend available, and I took advantage of driving to Lourdes and visiting Lourdes for the day, which was an absolutely wonderful, beautiful experience to be able to participate in that. So I brought some holy water back from my trip, and I actually still have some, which I brought with me this morning. And Hugo, if you wouldn't mind to just pass that out. And I would ask that, at your own leading or prompting, you do the sign of the cross with the holy water, and just whatever might be on your heart, or any prayers or anything, just ask the Holy Spirit or ask, Blessed Mary to intercede as a prayer. So that's holy water from Lourdes. So here's how the Immaculate Conception ties in terms of some of the change going on within the Church. The First Vatican Council, which started during the Feast of the Immaculate Conception on December 8th, Blessed Pius continued to assert opposition to liberal causes, and he wrote an encyclical called Quanta Cura, which condemned many errors or false tolerance in religious matters, socialism, communism, secret societies, and errors regarding the Church, and her rights and errors regarding Christian matrimony. Ultramontanists erroneously believed papal pronouncements stood as church dogma. So there was a belief that whatever the Pope said was actually, gospel in a way. The Council established clarity of papal authority in 1870. The infallible teaching authority of the Roman Pontiff. So basically there was the declaration of the papal infallibility, and what that meant was the Pope must declare from the chair of Peter ex cathedra by divine assistance. The Pope himself is not infallible or impeccable. And general writings and encyclicals do not hold the same weight as dogma. So, Ultramontanists, again, erroneously believed papal pronouncements stood as church doctrine. So the Council established clarity of papal authority. The Pope must declare from the chair of Peter, or ex cathedra. The Pope himself is not infallible or impeccable. Although writings still enjoy a very high authority of opinion, they are not considered infallible teachings of the Catholic Church on their own authority. So the irony of this council also defined the Pope's moral and religious authority just as his temporal power was stripped away when the Franco-Prussian War broke out in 1870, which the war resulted in the disbanding of Vatican I, which never officially closed until Vatican II. So by losing the Papal States, the Pope gained more moral authority over the Church as a whole. Now the Italian state and Church were at odds with the Italian state now persecuting the Church. The Pope was essentially held a prisoner of the Vatican until Mussolini agreed to an independent Vatican city-state in 1929. So the interesting thing here was the Pope now did not have the distraction of having to manage basically a government. So he could focus purely on the moral and spiritual aspects of the mission of the Church. So it was a pretty big departure from the way things used to be. And so I think it's fascinating how this, how the clarity was brought to the papal authority, because I think it's something that needed to be understood relative to all the changes at the time. So here's, I just threw this in here, here's a map of Italy during the 1800s that just shows you the papal states there. You can see there's the color of my shirt there. It's where the Papal States were, and to the south there was the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. To the north there was northeast, you can see in yellow, Venice, and then Lombardy, and there was a lot of territorial disputes there between Italy and Austria as well. A lot of change going on. And then there was German unification in what's called the Culture Kampf. So King Wilhelm I determined to strengthen Germany. This was the culmination of a long process by leadership of then the Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. So he wanted, so Wilhelm wanted a strong military and created a nationalist movement to overcome the North and South religious differences. So in Germany, you still had the Protestants in the North and the more traditional Catholics in the South. So this caused some strife and some division within Germany. So they were trying to, unify that. So in order to do that, like a good country in the 1800s, what do? You just go to war against someone, right? So he drew Prussia into war with surrounding countries to draw German unification. So he went to war in Denmark in 1864, Austria in 1866, and France in 1870. So that's 1870 was the Franco-Prussian War, which basically got the ball rolling for the Garibaldi and Manzini to take over Italy, where the Pope was deposed. So Germany actually became the dominant country in Europe in 1871 with Wilhelm declared the emperor. So at that time also, Germany declared what's called the Falk Laws in 1873, which led to the Kulturkampf, or translated cultural struggle. So they basically stated that the state had control of Catholic schools, or the state also had supreme control. They expelled Jesuit order and eventually every religious order in Germany. Bishops and priests had to acknowledge state supremacy over the church. And Bismarck tried to create Catholic divisions and allowed for exemptions to those who cooperated. Sounds a lot like what Catholics in government today that you hear about. By 1876, there were no more bishops in Prussia, with thousands of priests exiled, imprisoned, leaving Catholics without access to the sacraments. And interestingly, Blessed Pius IX said, no Catholic in Germany was obliged to obey the Falk Laws. So Bismarck eventually realized his anti-Catholic program was not working, and as a new socialist party was gaining strength in Germany, he knew he needed Catholic support to preserve the empire. Bismarck took advantage of the death of Pius IX to save face and change the course and end anti-Catholic policies. So he did an about-face. But it sounds like it was for purely political motivation and gain. So what do we get? More revolution in France. The Third Republic of France. Napoleon was captured during the Franco-Prussian War, and liberals took advantage of this by overthrowing the government to set up a Third Republic in France. The Third Republic worsened relations with the church and state in France. In 1905, laws passed which separated church and state, and all religious communities were banned in France. So it seems like, the 1800s, it's like this, with this new thought, was just an all-out attack against the church. So the Third Republic worsened relationships with the church and state in France, with cities more towards liberal reforms and rural areas sympathetic to moderate or conservative policies. All religious communities were banned in France, so no priest, brother, or nun was allowed to practice his or her vocation in France, and salaries were also withheld from priests. Looking back at the 1800s, one can see the start of a progression of how the ills of the 1800s would eventually lead to World War I and World War II. One can see also why the Blessed Mother appeared and spoke of reforming our ways when she appeared at Fatima. So I can see how this sort of all is leading up to the next century, which, when you think about all these new ideologies which push God aside, lead to some of the most heinous acts of the 20th century, which probably makes the 1800s look like a cakewalk. So now I'm going to talk about imperialism. Industrialization spread to Europe during the second half of the 19th century. So there was a growing need for new markets to keep capitalism going. This fostered colonial expansion in Africa and Asia. Imperialism was an economic and cultural phenomena. Technological and liberal ideologies fostered a superiority of Western European civilization all over the world, which kind of makes sense. That's sort of a natural outcome. When you have liberal thoughts or ideologies that exclude God in the picture, then it essentially puts man at the top, and man sort of being like God now makes himself superior. And so that it's just a different thought process. So Britain exemplified imperialism more than any other country. It was the most technologically advanced country in the world, and that was actually reflected in the culture with Queen Victoria. It involved democracy, patriotism, individualism, progress, and wealth. So Britain saw herself as a pinnacle of civilization. I don't know if people remember the expression, the sun doesn't set on the British Empire. That's, back in the 1800s, they pretty much conquered and dominated a lot of the other countries around the world to satisfy their imperialist desires. So, however, I don't think the Victorian spirit should be understood too cynically, for along with the pomp and the haughtiness of the age came actually an earnest morality, a respect for family, and a high regard for individual philanthropy. Victorians had a sense of social responsibility which helped temper the harsh world of early industrialized capitalism. Democratic reforms during the Victorian era increased representation among the working classes and introduced social legislation that provided for health care and better factory working conditions. So there's actually some positive outcomes. So imperialism brought the opening of Africa. So there were advances in medicine which allowed the exploration of the interior. So up until this time, what was not understood was causes of yellow fever, dysentery, typhus, and these diseases presented exploration. So there was new medicine, quinine, for yellow fever, and they understood how, mosquitoes transferred diseases, and so because of this new realization, they were allowed to overcome these hurdles that prevented them in the past. So Belgium created the Congo Free State in 1871. Britain and France got in the act, and within 20 years, the African continent was divided completely among European nations. This brought, unfortunately, great misery to Africa. Protestant and Catholic presence also flooded the interior. Interestingly, the Protestant missionaries focused more on Western culture, and the Catholic missionaries assimilated and adapted Catholicism with local cultures. And so this actually established a native clergy that grew slowly over time. And the first native African Catholic bishop was ordained in 1953. And I think as you listen to news today, you hear that there's kind of an explosion of Catholicism in Africa. And I believe there was it the first, one of the first African cardinals was just appointed by Pope Francis? Missionary apostolate in the Far East. So China and Japan. So missionary efforts in the Far East proved far more difficult than Africa. So between 1839 and 1841, Britain fought two wars with China, which were known as the Opium Wars, after which Britain gained long-term access to Hong Kong. Missionaries were seen generally as representative of Western expansion and were often subject to violent persecution in Asia. As a result of, the Japanese persecuted Christians over the centuries. There was actually a change that occurred in Japan as a result of restoration of a Japanese emperor in 1868. Japan actually opened up to Christianity and established a policy of tolerance of Christians. Japan also underwent a rapid modernization and adapted many aspects of business, legal, and military system with that of the Americas. So now I'm going to talk about the next pontiff, which was Leo XIII, and the changing world and his effect on it. So after the death of Pius IX, Leo was elected in 1878. He had to minister to a church suffering persecutions and marginalization as a result of the changes in the 1800s. The new pope enjoyed a position of great moral authority now that he did not have to be distracted by his temporal rule. Known for intellectualism and embracing Mary as mediatrix, he challenged the new modern evils threatening the 19th century. So Leo had a reputation of being more traditional and helped Pius with what was termed the syllabus of errors. He also spoke positively of modern society and advances in the science. So he started to marry the church with all the good things about the advances in the culture. So Leo would have to address a changing and hostile Europe and take on many schools of thought that were taking on the Western world. He was a strong pastoral leader and a firm defender of the faith. Does that sound a lot like Francis? So I'm going to talk about some of the ideologies of the time, and then finish up with some of a couple of Leo's writings. So there was secular humanism, which was emerging as a sort of new faith of Western culture. It's probably the most influential, and I think a lot of us can see that today, active in the U.S. Tends to embrace a growing nationalism and a blind faith in progress of civilization. It's exaltation of man as a replacement for God. So as philosophy, science, and technology drifted from the notions of God and religion, many began to argue that the world does not reflect the eternal wisdom and law of God. Therefore, standards that govern right and wrong do not apply, or at best they are relative. Instead of God, man became the subject of study, therefore putting man on the throne in place of God. In a way, humanism, which originated within the church, was hijacked by the secular and removed God from the picture. I think the end result of this is sort of a form of atheism and or agnosticism. Then there was Charles Darwin and the survival of the fittest. He was a British naturalist and originated the theory of evolution through what's termed natural selection. Two of In other words, if you take two of the same species and put them in different locations, they would evolve differently over time. Darwin was not religious or political, but his theories affected modern thinking. So interestingly enough, the church actually embraces the possibility of this, but it must be kept in mind that this is in the context of God ordering this. It's not a random thing. However, with God taken out of the picture, man is just another animal and behaves towards natural instincts. So if you think of Darwin's theory, there's a great evil in this, and it's really the unbridled control of passions. In addition to this, who is to say that natural selection has not created some human races superior than others? Many have argued that weeding out the weak and the poor among the human race is part of a natural selection process, and humanity is defined by the survival of the fittest. So Darwinism by itself strips human dignity and value as defined by God and the church. One can imagine the racism that this would foster. The irony of this is today's secular liberal thinking, which is driving God out of the culture and so embraces anti-racism, fully embraces Darwinism and evolution. So that's a contradiction if you really think about that. So there's Darwin during retirement. Karl Marx and the politics of atheism. So Karl Marx, who was around for a lot of the revolutions, the political and industrial, firsthand, saw the emergence of a large urban working class. He also noted that many political revolutions taking place, and Marx noted a widening gap between the wealthy and the poor as a result of what was termed laissez-faire economics, which is basically all about profit and doesn't care about the working person. That's laissez-faire economics. It's capitalism at its worst. He wrote articles that criticized capitalism, liberal democracy, religious beliefs, and practice, and proposed social, political, and economic struggle called communism. Communism was viewed by Marx as a necessary historical development for the culmination of human history. Communism relieves an individual of personal property. Everything belongs to the state and is shared by all. Everyone holds everything in common and works for the common good. Man becomes a tool of the state to the collective whole. Sounds like the Borg on Star Trek. Although communism sounds good on the surface, with utopian thoughts that everyone is economically equal, or otherwise known as egalitarianism, such that all deserve an equal piece of the pie, communism at its core is one of the most insidious and evil economic systems, as it strips an individual of his dignity by completely stripping any kind of ownership. Part of the dignity of human individuals, as measured by the church, is individual freedom, and communism strips an individual of any kind of freedom as total rights and property are confiscated. Also, if I know nothing and everything is provided by the state, what motivation do I have to work hard and get ahead if I'm not able to acquire the fruits of my labor? Who gets to decide what equal economic worth is? Yeah, you can see as we witness the fall of communism at the end of the 20th century how much of a failure it actually is as a result of this. Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis. He came up with a new psychoanalysis technique. I think he was kind of psycho. I often refer to him as Sigmund Freud. The ego, which is the conscious, or what is present, the superego, which is the preconscious link between the conscious and the subconscious, and the id, which is the subconscious mind. So the id was always trying to come to the conscious mind. Things like social norms and religion repressed the id, so he believed that the ego needed to satisfy the id. So basically what that means is morality represses the natural behavior of the mind. So the evil here is man is reduced to a mere animal with the focus on meeting instincts or whatever pleasure. There's no concept of self-control or sacrifice. It is every man for himself, basically. I think he probably goes along with Darwin. Maybe they're retired at the same place. Okay, I'm going to talk about a couple of the encyclicals of Pope Leo XIII. So he focused on the pastoral needs of the church. He wrote over 87 encyclicals. One of them, called Inscrutabile Dei, attacks the insatiable self-interest of any kind of economic and social or political system. Fidelity to Christian message expressed through the Catholic Church is the only hope for restoring and curing a society. Another one, Immortale Dei. Laws are for common good and should reflect truth and justice, and not framed according to the delusive caprices, which means unpredictable change, or like the masses or the mob, and the opinions of the masses of peoples. Church must gladly welcome improvements and age brings forth, and neither does the church welcome any particular form of government or monarchy with the union of the throne and the altar. Catholics have just reason to participate in public affairs. So these are some of the writings. So basically saying, Catholics matter, and, we have a right to participate and should participate in governmental affairs from a Christian perspective. He wrote Rerum Novarum, that sounds weird, Rerum Novarum, on capital and labor. So in this writing, he refutes principles of socialism, which proposes that a society hold all property in common to be administered by the state. Acquisition of private property is an intrinsic right of every human being who is called by God to use the material resources for his own benefit and welfare. The person gains private property as the fruits of his labor. Christianity, with its foundation in fraternal love, is the only solution for the problems of modern society. He rebuked the wealthy who, by their unjust and uncharitable exploitation of the working class, ignores the words of Christ. It is more blessed to give than to receive. Wealthy and working class are ordained that each should work together and dwell in harmony and agreement so as to maintain the balance of the body politic. The employer provides the capital required to produce goods, and the employee provides the labor to turn the capital into goods and services. One cannot live without the other. Both sides have duties to the other. Okay, we made it. Here's the questions. So, are there parallels with schools of thought from Europe of the 1800s and the America of today? What should the church's role in modern day society be? What is my role or your role personally as a Catholic Christian individual to engage in politics and government? What is my role as an individual contributor to promote social and economic justice? Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi, miserere nobis. Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi, miserere nobis. Agnus Dei, God